The first thing I tell students to do when they pair up to perform a duet is to retune. Okay, because if we're working as a class together, if everyone's a little bit out of tune, it doesn't matter collectively if there's 15, 20 people. But when there's just two people on stage, those differences in tuning are going to become much more apparent. So it's much more important then that you're actually perfectly in tune. So recheck your tuning. Then you've looked at number 12, which we'll go over in a minute again, as I mentioned. And you decide who's going to play what part. Who's going to play guitar 1, which is the melody. Who's going to play guitar 2, okay, which is the chords. So you decide that. Then as you go into your rehearsal time, that's the way you practice it. Okay, and then hand in hand with that, of course, if you look at this piece, it's an 8-bar piece. Find and isolate your problem areas, practice those together, then integrate it into the whole. Then I want you to think of this term called bookends, right? When people used to have books, we had these things at either end of the line of books to hold them in place. Those were called bookends, okay? So I think of it as the beginning, which would be the count off to the piece, and then the ending, which of course would be the ending. The count off needs to be very precise and in time. Pretend you're a drummer, right? Or if you've seen a rock band on stage where they go 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what you want to do, but in a more subtle way. If we're performing in a classical or a more mellow context, you might just look at your partner and go 1, 2, 3, 4. But it has to be rock steady, and it has to be where you're hearing the piece being performed, right? A lot of my students also will count off at a tempo very different from what they actually play at. So you want to make sure that you're counting off at the tempo that you're hearing in your head. If you're hearing, this is the first bar of the piece. If you're hearing, then you don't count off 1, 2, 3, 4, because that would be different. That would be, so really hear it, 1, 2, 3. Then you count off 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom. Usually I like to ask my students to have the melody person do the count off. The ending you actually have to discuss and decide how to perform it. I have a lot of my students that actually will play an ending, and then they'll just kind of blow it off after they hit the last note. They'll just, like, if we look at the last 2 measures, it goes, and they just blow it off. Instead, you want to really decide in advance, and you perform the ending. So you decide, do we want to let it ring for that half note and then silence it on beat 1, or should we add a fermata, let it ring out? So discuss the ending and be aware of how you're going to end, because the first and last impressions that the audience gets, the beginning of the piece and then the end of the piece, are the most important. If you make a mistake in the middle, but you just play through it beautifully and smile and keep going, no one's going to remember that mistake. So that is a good segue back to while you're performing. A couple things I want you to think about while you're performing. The first is listen to each other's volume. If anything, the melody should be a little bit above the chords, or they can be equal, but don't have the chords overpowering the melody, okay? And then also, what I mentioned before, if someone makes a mistake and you're playing as a duet, okay, unless you're playing with the recording obviously will just keep going no matter what. But you want to think, if you're walking together with a friend, if someone falls, you wait for them. So you're going to have to listen and have a little bit of give and take. And even if you're playing perfectly and that your partner makes a mistake and they're 1 beat behind you, you're going to have to add an extra beat. So it's not just enough to play your part perfectly. You have to listen to your partner and make sure you stay together, or someone may have to compensate by adding a beat or missing a beat, but you have to stay together, okay? And if you do make a mistake, don't broadcast it to the audience. Smile, don't communicate it, just act as if it didn't happen, and most likely no one will notice. So again, just to recapitulate or to mention again the things that I talked about. You retune. You decide who's playing what part. You think about the count off, which is the beginning, and you think about the ending, which is the end. Those are the bookends. During the piece, you play through your mistakes and listen to each other, and you balance your volume. So those are the things about how we actually rehearse and perform a piece. As far as being an audience member, which I mentioned before, if we are working in class together, while your classmates are performing, don't talk, don't make noise, try to be respectful. It's not a rock concert at a bar, which I love, of course, but we need to be quiet if we're at a setting where music is heard much more quietly. Indian classical music or Western classical music. Some other cultures, of course, it's more appropriate to speak during a performance. But here, be respectful in class and let your classmates perform, and then we can all clap and talk about it after. So now let's actually look at the piece itself. It's very easy. I wrote these first 2 duets, number 12 and number 16, which we're going to get into later on page 29, just as vehicles for you to learn how to perform and rehearse. and be an audience member. So they're not very difficult. They're not going to sound as cool, if I may say so myself, as the earlier pieces, because for the earlier pieces, even if you were playing a very simple melody, I was able to put some pretty cool stuff behind you to bring it to life, you know? So in this case, it's very dry, okay? So it's really just a vehicle to get you up and running as far as performing. Later in the book, your duets will sound much cooler. So let's look at the melody. It's super simple, right? It's not a big deal. Let me play it for you. I'll play it with the metronome, and of course you have these on the CD tracks as well. The CD tracks, you can actually pan hard left or right, and if you want to just isolate your track or isolate your partner's track, if you have a stereo that you can pan the balance on, you should hear mostly just one track isolated if you pan it all the way left or right. There may be a little bit of reverb, stereo reverb bleeding through. So let me just play the melody for you. It's quite simple. I don't even really need to go through the note naming. It's pretty easy, but you should, of course, do that at home. Go through and say all the note names. So let me play this for you, and I'll play just the melody so you can hear it. So I've got the metronome pretty slow here. It's at 79. 3, 4. So that was guitar 1. Here's guitar 2. Only thing to be careful of here is the C major is the last 2 bars. Remember, if it's a whole note, you come in on beat 1. If it's half notes, 1 and 3. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that was the part separate, and they're meant to be played separately. Let me play it for you once together just so you can kind of hear how it's going to sound. Of course, you have this on the SoundCloud as well. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's duet number 12 and a little bit of a talk about performing and rehearsing.